Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So some of you might be surprised to know that it wasn't until early April at Archives of the Impossible that Darren and I first met in the flesh. It was almost a year after we started recording Event Horizon. We had the opportunity to meet again in person last weekend when Darren was here in the Denver area to do a very well-received talk for MUFON. We had a whole day together, and as you can imagine, we spent the entire time talking. One of the topics that came up over and over in a variety of ways is how to understand the larger design unfolding in the world right now and the role that free will plays in it all, especially as it intersects with what we know about the possible role of non-human intelligence in human affairs. This intersection was perfectly epitomized in Matthew Brown's most recent interview with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp's podcast Weaponized, when he posited, "What I have learned is that we live in a dream, a carefully constructed reality. We make use of a science that is tightly controlled, tightly suppressed, and distorted. I think I have a good degree of confidence that they're here because of us. I think life, especially sentient life, is a precious thing. And I think to some, we might be a resource." This left everybody dangling, wondering what he meant by that. So this is the topic of today's conversation. So, Darren, to what degree are NHI overseeing human affairs?
This is an ongoing question, and we've talked about, and I've talked about in other podcasts too, that disclosure is tricky and prickly because the issue isn't just, are there aliens visiting us, but to what degree has our entire civilization perhaps been controlled, even seeded by these various others? So the implications are immense. It was very interesting hearing Matthew Brown in that interview. I thought to myself, it would be good to reflect on what he said in light of what experiencers have been told over time. Because again, some people can make the mistake of thinking we don't know anything about the intention or the agenda of these beings, and we have to rely on government, which usually means military personnel, to tell us. And they often seem to lean on this, either we don't know anything, or they leave it with a kind of ominous tone, like what was said here. And now we don't know the full context of what Matthew was discussing there, but the fact that they ended an episode with that notion that they may see us as a resource, that can be taken many different ways. I think some people could recognize that as an energetic thing, and that's true of all life forms, that we're all energy. But many people, I think, will take that as a potentially ominous sign that they want to use us, that they see us as cattle or some sort of commodity that they use. So this is something that I'm really looking forward to digging into with you, Janis, because like you said, this is part of our conversations. We were talking nonstop, like you said, last weekend as we hiked around the beautiful areas where you live. And this is something that comes up a lot for us. We actually tackled this notion of a control structure, whether alien, human, or some combination of the two, on an earlier podcast. I think we've been out ahead of this more than most. So let me pass it back to you. When you first heard him say that, what did you think about what he said? But more importantly, how did you think that would be received by the public?
We both probably would think it'd be perceived like everybody else listening. I think one of the things I think a lot about in this process of what we call awakening or whatever this is that's happening on the planet is language, and the degree to which it's extraordinarily critical, and the degree to which we lack language that is going to help us really understand. So, for example, word resource could be anything, right? I know a lot of people will default to the assumptions they have about we live in a prison planet, we are, we're being recycled and we're being controlled, and that immediately will speak to that. When I hear that, though, because I don't have that as a dominant paradigm, I think resource could be anything. I mean, resource can be, you're a resource for me. I mean, you're somebody I go to for elucidation and conversation. And I mean, it doesn't have to mean something nefarious. So I think challenge in language is really going to be an issue when we're talking about communications with NHI, and not just language, but I think because we're going to draw from the paradigms that are standard for us. And as we all know here, we live in a very threat-focused world. I mean, look at a ton of our language. It's either sports related or war related. We do battle with, our demons. We conquer, we have a very particular set of dominant paradigmatic lexicons that we never question. I think that's a problem when we're interacting with species that may have a very, very different understanding of the nature of reality. So like, I know for example, we've talked before about how there seems to be some lack of concern about human suffering or human mortality. But what is that if you're a species that knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that these bodies are not, they're just temporary anyway? You know, they're not that worried about it because if you quote unquote die, you're basically passing through a portal into another space and you'll have another body, right? So I think there's a lot here that we're going to have to be mindful about and careful about. And that's what I thought about when I heard him say that. And I know you and I've had a lot of conversation about well, first of all, we don't really know. And second of all, how do we help ourselves not be so afraid? And what does it mean if we start to interact from an assumption that we're cattle versus from an assumption that we have an experience as humans on a planet that's extraordinarily beautiful and biodiverse that could share, that is beautiful and that others want to participate in some way?
Yeah, great points. And the language piece is really well said, because you and I both know that in our history, as much as we have in common and have similar spiritual backgrounds, similar spiritual trainings, even you and I, as much as we recognize we had a vast amount in common, it took months and months and months of conversations, like multiple hour conversations, to really flesh out what we meant by certain terms. Like you and I had this conversation ongoingly about free will and the self, but then we realized sometimes we were speaking of the self from the perspective of the body mind of Janis and Darren, and sometimes we meant more at the sort of oversoul level. Of course, the challenge is in English, or any language for that matter, we don't really have terms that distinguish those two. So we have to go out of our way either to become familiar enough with each other that we know what we're referring to, or we have to be very specific with kind of awkward terminology to make sense of this. And this kind of plays into as well something you and I have talked about, and I've talked about in classes and podcasts, and that is how telepathy is so much more efficient here, because there's no miscommunication. You can actually share the fullness of what you're trying to communicate rather than have to rely on these kind of clunky symbols that we call words. Now, in terms of what Matthew said, yes, I agree with you. I think about the word resource, and I think about it in many different ways. Even when people say things like the Greys see humans as containers for souls, again, the question is, while everybody's freaking out about that, the question is, in what way did they mean that? Because if they mean the body, yes, then shedding that is no different than taking off a cardigan. So this really does change things. And I'm thinking here about, there was a case where someone had a mantis being in front of them, and the mantis being was almost a bit frustrated that the human being was not recognizing that they meant no harm. And at one point, this human being perceived their body being thrashed about, basically. And then suddenly, in a split second, it was reconstituted. And it's very interesting how different people interpret that event, because some people will say that's clearly a malevolent entity that was trying to scare him. But another way to look at it, and the way that I actually looked at it, was that the mantis being was trying to show the person that they are not their body, and that fear is a mentality, it's a energetic wavelength which diminishes you. And this fits with something you were referring there to, because I think something people really underestimate is the degree to which there is no fixed relationship with these beings, with these various beings, with any being for that matter. It really depends on how we choose to interact with that being. If we assume they're better than us, they're more powerful than us, they can control us, that will largely set the energetic signature by which we communicate with them. And many of the, say, less than benevolent beings, less than mature beings, fully know that and will use that as a tactic to make us feel diminished so they can control us. So one thing we're going to talk about today is that it's not that there's these fixed arrangements that we just have to get used to, but how we choose to show up makes all the difference. I think it's something both you and I recognize, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think about this too a lot. It's like, there's so much I can't know. I can guess at, we can talk about it, we can compare notes, we do, lots of us do. But at the end of the day, this question you just raised is always there in front of me. How do I want to show up? Because that's the one thing I have some choice over. And at least for me, I don't want to live with fear, is my master. Even if it is a scary future, I gain nothing by living that way today. And I have everything to gain by basically assuming up going wide. And I don't experience myself as somebody who's trapped and enslaved. I've never experienced that. So maybe it's a little easier for me. I mean, I've definitely had hard luck experiences like a lot of people, but I just don't fundamentally feel that way. So I'm not dealing with that, which I think is a slightly different animal that we do project out. Unfortunately, having deep pools of fear, especially if it's distorted in its pockets and you don't know where it is something that we end up projecting. And I think that's part of the nature of reality. I don't know that anybody can, I don't even know if NHI could stop us from doing that if we're really in it, because we're basically creating the reality as we see it through a mental projection, even though we have no idea that's what we're doing. So I do spend a lot of time just deciding to be in the most neutral energetic state, which I experience as love, acceptance, compassion. It's not actually neutral feeling inside of me, but I think energetically, that's the neutral stance. Because I'm pretty sure I remember that stance allows me to navigate through a lot of rooms, even if they're scary and they have scary beings in them, because it's the energetic connection between the two beings that ends up causing an effect. So if I'm afraid and I'm in the presence of something that is wanting to dance with me energetically, and it's, inviting me to be afraid, now I've just entered a dance, and that's on me. So if I want to get out of that dance, I need to neutralize my charge. That's the way I've construed it. I know it's a little bit out there, but that's the way I meet all of this, and it feels a lot, no matter how I die, it feels a lot better to live this way than to be afraid and be thinking about prison planets all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. And as a really pragmatic example of this, I remember one time hiking in a national forest, and I've told this story in a few different places, and suddenly from up behind a tree stepped a mountain lion, a very large mountain lion. And he didn't actually look that perturbed. He didn't look like he was glaring at me and showing me his teeth. But nevertheless, I went into a fear response immediately. Now, initially, when I spoke to the park ranger afterwards, he said I handled it well because I made myself as big as possible. I shouted. I made myself look like I was going to be a problem. But then when he moved off to the side of the path, I went down the trail. When I went around the corner, I started running, right? Now, the park ranger said it can feel your running feet through the pads of its feet, through the earth, right? And what does it do? It sets the energetic pattern. So you are now prey and it is predator. When it really did not have that perspective when I first encountered it. If it wanted to have me for lunch, it would have jumped me from behind and gone for my neck. That's what I found out later. It clearly didn't. If anything, it was being curious and friendly. But once I chose fear, that then determined the nature of the interaction until I had to stop and turn around and run back at it. And then it thought twice and went off to the river again. But that was a really useful experience for me to think about how this actually works. And what we're really saying here is that because we're all splinters of source, that means each of these alien beings and us, we each have the same capacity really to draw upon. So what we want to sort of explore today is how we can reconcile being an eternal consciousness moving through incarnations with apparent sovereignty and agency with notions of humanity being a seeded species as part of an ongoing species-level biological experiment. So this is the notion, and some people feel like these are mutually exclusive, that either you're a being with sovereignty that is an eternal soul, or you're part of a biological experiment or part of a simulation and you have no control, no agency. We're going to argue today that both are true. Now, I was thinking we could walk through each of the common ways that people tend to think about this relationship. So the first one that comes up is the notion of a school, and here we have the notion of spiritual development. So the core idea here is Earth is a place for learning, soul growth, and spiritual evolution. Key themes are reincarnation, karma, free will, lessons of polarity, so love versus fear, service to self versus service to others, in the case of the raw contact material. And again, some examples would be the Law of One, the raw contact material talks about this. Theosophy talks about this, and this is very much in line with New Age thinking. So, Janis, how do you look at this notion of Earth being a school, and therefore perhaps some of these beings either being teachers or overseers that are overseeing that ongoing process of the kindergarten class, if you will?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was in my mind earlier to talk about, you and I have had a lot of conversations about the word school. And I know that it is used in the light worker world and a lot of the, the world of people who are seekers in a very particular way. It often connotes, at least to me, this idea of labor, of, work. Like you have to go to school like a kindergartner and you have to sit there and you have to learn things. And I don't think that that's not true. I think there's probably some elements of that, but I've just struggled with, like, all right, I don't feel it that way. I don't experience it that way. It's more like, and this is where I think language is going to become really important, an opportunity for advanced mastery. Like I incarnate in order to, I'm a leather worker, and I've been working on trying to etch in a very particular way, like fine, or I know a mandala. I'm making a mandala, the sand mandalas, and there's a lot of nuanced placement of the sand in different colors and in different patterns. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to incarnate and try to put it all together and create something that I've never done before. And it's hard. It's work, because I'm challenging myself to get more nuanced, more detailed, more precise, more elegant. But that's not the same as I got to go to school and learn my ABCs to me. And one is kind of drudgery and the other is, it's still a challenge. I've still got to focus. I need discipline. I need practice. I'm going to probably mess up in some cases because I'm trying to put a bunch of new skills together that I haven't put together in the same way on Earth plane. But it's what I want. It's driven from a desire to enhance my skill set. I think for me personally, that makes a pretty big difference. If you're talking to me on one hand, you're telling me I have to go to school versus I get to go improve my capacity to be really elegant artist. They're very different. So that is really that mastery paradigm is the one that I feel is most resonant with my personal experience. And I suspect probably everybody, even though we don't really remember it. And I know from, people I have in my life, there's a bunch of us that do feel like this is drudgery. I know that and I think it is hard. It does feel like drudgery sometimes. But I would challenge us to think about, well, what if that drudgery is you really trying to work a whole new angle that you've never been able to fully get in the same way. And this time you're doing it in this one way. And it's just hard. But, you're going to do it. You're going to do it how you're going to do it. You're certainly going to get lots of credit from yourself for coming and trying. And I'm sure it'll make a difference.
Yeah. And this is an interesting one because we're back to this question of language and connotation. And I remember you and I had conversations, and when I realized that we weren't saying something very different actually from each other, we pretty much were in the same perspective, even though it seemed superficially like we were saying different things. It's because for me, that connotation of school is kind of like the mastery you described. So I think it's a point well made in the sense that a lot of people might have a notion of a certain kind of school, like when we go from being kids who can run outside and play and be in the trees and nature to suddenly having to sit in a classroom and learn ABCs and math. Yeah, that sounds like drudgery. But for me, I remember, for instance, this comes up for me every time the seasons begin to change. It gets a little bit cooler and the beginning of September rolls around. I actually have this good feeling in my body of this association with that mastery you're talking about. It's time to go back to school, which to me actually connotes that enjoyment you're talking about, the desire to enter in, grow my skillfulness, develop skillful means through practice. So to me, that's what school does actually connotate. And so for me, it's not this negative thing, although I think we can sometimes think about it that way depending on our life experience. But I also want to say, in light of what you kind of hinted at there, and this comes down to language again, what we mean by I, by the self, because the body mind here, which only remembers a certain part of the total, a fairly limited part actually, might sometimes be repelled by some of the things that arise in our life that we have to work with. But when you hear from people who've had near-death experiences, people who've remembered that phase in between lives, they realize that they themselves were part of that decision to set up these events in their lives so that they could have these opportunities to learn. So even the things that we want to put in a package and say that's a negative event, I don't like that event, from the perspective of outside of incarnation, that actually was chosen partly by us so that we would have that opportunity to work with it, to grow in that skillful means. So again, it really matters from what perspective you're engaging with each of these ideas. So that's the school. Let's move on to the next one, which I think neither one of us will resonate with so much. This is the notion of a farm, that the aliens are basically farming us either for exploitation or for harvesting of some sort. The core idea here is that the Earth is being used or exploited by more powerful entities for resources, that's that word again, whether physical, energetic, or psychic. Key themes here are notions like loosh harvesting, so fear or an emotion used as an energy that they actually consume, control systems, parasites, if you will, and soul harvesting. So examples here are shown in Gnostic traditions with the Gnostic archons, the Matrix films, David Icke's reptilian theories, and Robert Monroe's loosh concept. So the alien role in this particular way of framing this, Janis, is as predators, farmers, or jailers who manipulate or feed off humanity. So how do we look at this from a more multi-perspectival view, being non-dual practitioners? The farm notion, what do you say?
Non-dual means everything and it's like all things are coexisting, right? So I don't buy it. Like, I just don't buy it on the surface that it's a farm. I don't buy that humans have no sovereignty. I don't buy that all these billions of souls are like, yeah, sure, we'll go be on a farm for this, play this game out with this NHI. It just doesn't resonate for a whole bunch of reasons that some of, that anybody would understand, and some are maybe a little more esoteric. But I mean, I think you and I've talked about this a lot, and I've said this before. The place I always default to, and that is very consonant with every Eastern teaching as well as all mystical traditions and indigenous traditions, is you cannot be enslaved. Your soul cannot be enslaved. We are sovereign. So I go, well, whatever's happening here in this Leela, this play of consciousness on this planet, is a bunch of sovereign souls playing out a drama they want to play out for reasons that I can't fully remember for myself, let alone anybody else. But, so when I can really perch there and stay there, it is quite entertaining. There's plenty of moments I'm like, wow, that was an interesting curly cue. Who thought that one up? It makes it easier to deal with sometimes very hard stuff. If I come fully in as human, I'm very adhered to my presence here. I kind of forget that I'm a sovereign soul or whatever. That doesn't happen very often to me anymore, but when it does, then yeah, I mean, I'm terrified, right? I'm terrified by a lot of things. NHI is the least of it. I'm frankly more terrified by my fellow man than NHI. And that does get us into this conversation about the insinuation Matthew Brown made about what's really going on here. If we're going to talk just in terms of sort of the human experience, and we're going to forget our sovereign souls and our own creative reasons for being here for a minute. But, I feel grateful that I have that perspective, and I feel like it's a much better way to live, because even if it's totally wrong, it brings me more peace now. And why would I poison my peace? If I'm going to be terrified, I might as well wait until it actually happens. I don't think I need to front load my terror. Kind of a practical decision. But I also think it leads humanity into this, like, if we believe this story and we start perpetuating it, we're telling it to other people, and then we're just exporting fear everywhere. And seriously, people, is that the way we are gonna meet whatever it is that's coming, whatever is that's here? I don't think so. Look at where that's gotten us. I look around the world and I say, well, it really hasn't done anything. We're on the brink of extinction in multiple ways. I don't think that our threat vigilance and our meeting everything with war is helping humanity or anything else, not helping any life. As far as I can tell, it seems to be leading us down the path of sort of deep degradation. So that feels like a degrading stance, so I wouldn't choose it. I don't not choose it, though, because I've figured out reality. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need to know for sure in order to decide not to have that stance. I know not everybody's comfortable that way, but that is personally where I've gotten with it. And I don't buy, just for the record, as I just said, I don't buy the prison plan. It doesn't make sense among all the different narratives anyway, even independent of that.
Right. And the prison planet, just to be really clear, is a little bit different than the farm, but they are often related. Farm kind of implies perhaps some degree of symbiosis a little bit. And, there's a few things you touched on there that I kind of want to riff on. One is this notion that by assuming a certain energetic relationship is in place, that actually perpetuates more of that energetic relationship. This, again, is the key, and I said this at the outset, right? And I know that you and I both agree on this, that as long as you believe that's the only energetic possibility, that will continue to perpetuate, right? So it's really important that you think about that and choose to decide proactively how you want to energetically align. Now, the other thing I want to say is that I do believe, just like we see in biology, that there are parasitic entities. I think, again, everything is connected. And so we see this marching of really simple organisms up to very, very advanced organisms. And all of this is somehow the outspilling of source and then the collection back into source again. So in that sense, I think it does matter. And when you do engage in fear, I do think there's something to the notion that if you're resonating around shame, guilt, fear, those kinds of vibrations, that it does make you more susceptible to some kinds of forms, not necessarily biological forms, that are kind of parasitic. Now, we also want to remind ourselves that we have this vast symbiosis throughout nature. And I would say not just in nature, but also energetically, right? So you think about the numbers of bacteria that are in your stomach right now. And most of them have actually worked out the symbiotic relationship where it's beneficial for both sides. So this happens over and over again. And again, I think is hinting at the fact that everything's all connected. So in that sense, I would ask people to look at the farm that way. There's many ways that farming in terms of resources can be a purposefully driven, positive kind of experience, and it can be symbiotic. But that said, how we choose to entertain these ideas, how we engage energetically makes all the difference.
Sorry. Yeah, you're right. I jumped to the prison planet when you asked about farm. So I've thought about this one too. And it kind of makes me laugh because for exactly what you said, like we are completely interdependent with all sorts of beings all the time. We've got more, I think we have more parasitic beings in our body than anything else. Honestly, it cracks me up that people are always trying to clean their gut. And I'm like, good luck with that one. And why? But early on when I heard about the Loosh theory and that sort of stuff, my sense was like, well, if we're producing energy in the form of emotion, which we do, humans emote all over the place, as we both know. I mean, we just are just off-gassing emotion and energy constantly. And if there's some thing out there that benefits from that, and, then it's like a moth attracted to light, then yeah, I mean, of course it's going to do what it does. And do I think that's a bad thing? No. I think if you don't like it, then you need to learn how to work with your emotions and stop off-gassing. And I actually think that's it's one of the messages that comes in over and over to contactees is you all are really messy because you're so awake. You're just sending off energy and you're wasting it. And you're not using it in the ways that are going to serve you and the collective. And you're overproducing things that create distortion in your worlds, and it's causing you trouble. I mean, I understand that our source challenge here on this planet is our consciousness. It's not the stuff that other people are doing to us. The world looks the way it does because we're co-creating it from inside, because it's starting from our mental constructs. And those who would keep us asleep play to those mental constructs just to keep us collapsing the wave around the negative images. But we don't have to do that. It does take discipline. It takes some understanding. It takes some, awareness and consistent practice to pull your mind back, to pull your emotions back, to kind of contain them, to get into neutral. Those are upper level skills. And frankly, most of us can't be bothered. We just want to watch our TV and eat our Cheetos, I guess, and drink beer. And then I'm like, well, then that's on us. Like, I don't know. You want to grouse about how you're being victimized and there are people feeding on your lush, but you're like eating your Cheetos and getting pissed off, and they're eating your Cheeto pissed off gas. I mean, like, anyway, not a great metaphor, but you get the idea. It always makes me kind of giggle, and it also kind of irritates me. Like, it starts with us. It starts with each one of us. If we don't like it, we need to change it. And then you will not have as much stuff in the atmosphere for people to feed on.
Yeah, and this is where that notion of quantum activism, which we've referred to before, comes in, because a lot of people, I think, mistakenly believe that life is determined and the quality of life is determined by physical resources. Whereas I think, and I know that you believe too, that it all begins with energy. It begins with how we relate with life. How we relate with life will actually decide what collapses into reality versus something else. So this is really, really key. And this is something that's come up in the lore quite a bit, even outside of, again, non-dual circles, outside of New Age circles, is this notion that some of these beings, again, with a more service to self kind of mentality, It's not about good versus evil. It's about stages of awareness. But the ones that are still thinking that they're separate and you're separate and they want to take from you because they assume either you get it or they get it, they will use this kind of shock and awe kind of mentality. And we think back to the Gulf War. I remember that was something that was actually discussed. We're going to use shock and awe to basically disable the enemy so they're so overwhelmed that they don't even know how to think straight, basically. That's what can happen here is some of these beings can show up with really impressive technology. They can sometimes impact our perception. They can clearly do that, actually. And so it's on us again to choose how we're going to energetically respond. And just because something looks bigger than us or brighter than us doesn't mean that it's inherently more powerful, because ultimately we're all splinters of source. We're all energetically aligning. And this notion, if there's one thing I would want to emphasize more than anything else today, it's this notion of energetic resonance. The energy you put out will resonate with something out there. That's just a law of the universe, if you will. So this makes a huge difference. And I think this does impact who gets impacted by which beings and why, which again, I would argue should behoove us to take our energetic wavelength very, very seriously. And it comes down to what you're talking about. How we live our lives, the habits we cultivate do make all the difference when it comes to energy. And from my perspective, everything that arises, every person, every event, every object is an energetic configuration. And once you see it that way, and you see that you're here as a wizard to basically learn to work with energy, to wield it and to transmute it, then everything changes. So that's what I think about when I think about any of these notions. So that's the farm. Now let's move on to the next one, which is somewhat related, but perhaps less of a negative connotation. And that's the notion of a zoo. So here we have observation and experiments kind of implied. So the core idea with a zoo is that Earth is like a wildlife preserve or a petri dish. Humanity is being observed rather than guided or exploited. So the key themes are non-intervention, scientific curiosity, comparative development, and this notion of a quarantine, that if there's any degree of control, it's only to say that you're not ready yet to meet your galactic neighbors, so we're going to keep you in quarantine until you've matured to some degree. Examples, the zoo hypothesis in astrobiology, and some interpretations of UFO contact narratives kind of imply this. So what is the alien role in the zoo kind of arrangement? They are as scientists or caretakers watching human behavior with minimal interference. So what value do you see in the zoo hypothesis?
I mean, hard to tell. I mean, I assume so. Actually, this one seems kind of common sense to me. We do it. We watch other beings that are different than us all the time. I stop and watch ants regularly because they fascinate me, the way they organize. So I don't know. This doesn't stress me out. It seems likely. I think that, that non-interference, the non-interference question is the one that I have the biggest question around, because it does feel like, not that there's interference, but there's some degree of involvement. That seems pretty obvious. So doesn't totally follow from that. But I do feel like it's probably likely. The big question is there nefarious intent and nefarious involvement? Because if that's the case, then it's a slightly different set of questions. This one doesn't speak to me of that at all, even though lots of people will probably cast it that way as somehow wrong to watch us. I mean, how many times have you watched your neighbors through the windows just to see what they're doing? If you have the capacity to fly to our planet and keep an eye, or appear in our planet and keep an eye on us and watch how we're developing, especially if you had some involvement in who we became and who we are, it makes sense to me that you would do that. What about you? Does that stress you out? And how do you think about it?
No, I definitely don't see it as a negative thing. I see it as fairly neutral. It's one of the most neutral of the various hypotheses. And what's interesting is what it raises in us in terms of a reaction, because of course, on the one hand, like you say, we have zoos all over the place. But suddenly when we're the one in the zoo, we don't like that notion, right? So we have basically a double standard there when it comes to how we'll treat other species of the animal kingdom versus how we want to be treated. But even then, again, I would really argue for this notion of stages of consciousness development that are emergent over time, that over time embrace ever larger spheres of care and concern. And the reason I bring that up is because we can see in human history that we've gone from being familial and only caring about our family, to being tribal, to having nation states, to developing something like civil rights and human rights across the board. And eventually, even that's now moved into animal rights. And the notion is that eventually you get to this point where you have a cosmocentric perspective, which is basically non-dual, where you recognize that everything and everyone is an extension of you. The quarantine notion does make some sense to me, although I agree with you, there's some conflict here because there does seem to be some intervention. I think the way that I look at it is that the most powerful of the beings are the most benevolent, actually, because I think the more you align with and return to source consciousness, the more you're able to impact and basically write into the source code of reality itself. So those kind of walk hand in hand. So the ones that are still thinking about resources and control and domineering, I'm taking it so you can't have it, there's only so much to go around, all of that is a lower form of consciousness. I think that I align with the perspective that is described in the Law of One, the raw contact material. I really recommend it for those who haven't read it. Basically, it's information that's channeled through a human being coming from this collective consciousness called raw. And the notion there is that free will is really championed. So the notion is that the only way any being, any sentience across the history of the cosmos learns is through trial and error. We don't learn by someone just telling us. We actually have to experience the consequences. And it casts itself in the polarities of darkness and light that you and I have talked about. Again, this is why I move away from this notion of good versus evil and prefer stages of awareness. So from their perspective, the most benevolent ones, the most powerful ones, step back and let us have our free will, not just as individuals, but as a species. And they also allow some of these mid-level kind of beings that still dominate, but are maybe more technologically powerful than us. They let them step in as well and to some degree manipulate us so that we learn not to give away our power, right? That's part of the way that we learn. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. I sometimes hear people saying, if there's good guys, why don't they show up and liberate everybody? But that would be like coming into a preschool class and shutting it down because it's not being run very fairly, but then the preschool kids never actually learn. So if I think about a zoo hypothesis, I think it's a partial truth within that overarching truth about spiritual development, I really think is key here. All right, we're going to go into the next one. This one comes up a lot, especially because we have evidence arising even out of astronomy, physics, that this might be a simulation, Janis. So that leads some people to say, aha, what if this entire reality construct is just that? It's a construct. We're basically these beings inside a video game that some alien consciousness has come up with, and we are their entertainment. So here the notion is that we live in a constructed reality. The core idea is that Earth is a simulation, the entire planet, not just parts of it. And there's a designed reality with rules, just like a video game, with players and objectives. A key theme is that choice, illusion, avatars, leveling up, and exit strategies all come here. Like, in other words, is there a way you can exit the game? And examples here, simulation theory, which is becoming more and more common. Gnosticism had this notion with the false reality, basically. And we have Philip K. Dick's material, the Seth material, on it goes. So the alien role here, if it's the simulation notion, is that they're like programmers or architects, civilization or reality architects, if you will, or even fellow players who may be outside or above the game. So this notion of a game or simulation, how does that land for you?
I think it's useful up to a point. Again, it's useful because I do think there's something about the creation of a projection of a third dimensional reality so that the soul can have this experience that is probably simulation-like, right? And to the extent that I feel like my physical body is a projection of my soul, my oversoul, it would be kind of an avatar in that way. Where it gets limited is like there's some sort of outside player controlling me. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. It would be more, I'm coming into the game as this avatar in a landscape that is kind of like a simulation. But where it starts to break down is, this locus of control isn't you. There is a you do have a soul, but it's being controlled again. Always we go back to that. Someone else has got hold of your soul. Or you're telling me I don't have a soul, but then we're back to like, well, what's consciousness again? We're sort of back to the very basic questions of, well, are we even sentient? You're telling me I'm AI. And then it just kind of gets silly. Like, well, I don't know. I can't know. It's a mouse chasing its own tail. And I don't find it helpful, nor do I find it comports with my experience. It doesn't comport with any of the teachings, the oldest teachings on the planet about what this experience is. It doesn't comport with, the mystical experiences of reverence and divination and unity consciousness and other like memories and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you just have to shelve if you really buy that whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle, that concept. But I do think that in terms of just helping people understand like third dimensional structures and the way that we can have the perception of a physical reality and time, for example, there's some utility in that. It's just that we do humans just tend to take everything to the hilt, don't we? What do you do with that? We've never actually talked about how you feel about this one.
Yeah, well, I've done a couple podcast episodes on this because there's some elements that I think land for me and some that don't. And it really comes down to nuance, as is often the case. Because on the one hand, like you kind of hinted at there, you and I both would recognize that to some degree, recognizing that the ultimate nature of reality is non-dual and that you have this dance between the formless and the form, then from that perspective, again, from an ancient Eastern tradition perspective, basically any manifestation is simulation-like. And that's a key qualifier you added there, right? Simulation-like. It's a kind of construct. The notion of Maya is this notion of illusion, that the manifest physical world is largely illusory. Now, a key element that I always bring up in these podcasts and in my classes is that it's purposeful illusion, though. A lot of times people hear, oh, fake news, you're saying this is not real, should I just not care? And I would say quite the opposite, that this is set up for the evolution of consciousness. And we are part of the beings that set it up to begin with. We wrote the play and now we're characters in the play. This again comes down to how you identify with yourself at that oversoul level versus as a character level of Janis and Darren. But in that perspective, yes, it is kind of like a construct, but it's not nefarious, nor is it being done just for the entertainment of some alien group. I think we enjoy actually, as splinters of source, having all sorts of different kinds of experience. And that's indeed what this is. But again, it's purposeful. So simulation-like, and the reason why it's really important to qualify that is because the assumption here, and this arises out of computer technology that's only been around for a few decades for us in our civilization. The notion here generally is that the aliens live in the quote-unquote real world, and we're the simulation that's basically copying that. And that I reject. I just don't think that's true at all. And again, the irony is that from a non-dual perspective, every kind of form or manifestation is simulation-like. It's a construct. It's a dream in the mind of Source, or the mind of God, if you will. So it works, but only with certain caveats. And again, this makes me just want to emphasize that any of these hypotheses come with assumptions baked in, right? So what we're trying to do today, and that I think we do ongoingly with our work, is, think through what are the axioms, what are the assumptions that give rise to this notion. All right, next one. This one is a bit of nuance because I'm going to throw two together here, and they're related, and it really comes down to how you think about prison. Because, there is this notion in Christian tradition, for instance, with prison, that it's also a place that you can reform. So it's not just meant to be punishment, but it's also an opportunity to reform. So let's talk about the notion of hospital/prison planet. So this could be either healing or containment or some degree of both. So the core idea here is that Earth is a place for damaged or dangerous souls to be healed or quarantined. Key themes are soul rehabilitation, karmic balancing, and containment of malevolent forces. So in that sense, the containment would be so that we don't hurt others outside of the containment. Examples, Dolores Cannon's work talks about this, that Earth is a place for troubled souls to some degree. We have the notion of a lot of people who came in. I think you and I would be on this list, Janis, in terms of our self-identity, beings that came in to help with a potential ascension, and that actually the density here is pretty low. It's a pretty intense place to be, even to the point where people can forget the larger context. They can come in with a mission and actually get drowned out by the density all around them. This also is to some degree referenced in, you could in a stretch think about this in Buddhist cosmology with the notion of samsara. So the alien role here would be as healers or wardens or observers of a rehabilitative process. So there's a lot in here, and there's a lot of nuance depending on what you really emphasize. But what do you think about this notion of hospital/prison?
I mean, the idea that we're a bunch of damaged souls or a bunch of damaged souls end up getting sent here, I think That's my least favorite resonant one of all. Again, I think all souls are sovereign, and every soul incarnates where it chooses to for its own creative purposes, and that includes Earth. I will not disagree that this is a fairly dense planet. I do, but I think that's part of the fun of it. It's part of the reason you come, is to be really asleep and to struggle to wake up and to like be lulled back to sleep again. It's that process. That's what Baba Muktananda said as he was taking Mahasamadhi. It means he's leaving his body. He told somebody, that was really fun. Maybe I'll do it again. Like, go start over from a rock, and because it's an interesting experience for this divine sliver of God, this unique divine sliver of God, to have the experience of slowly awakening. Because what else are you going to do? You're here for eternity. You might as well have experiences. So I don't find it problematic that the idea that it's a dense planet, that it's easy to get very lulled into sleep here and to stay asleep for, I don't know, long time. Again, we're inferring time, and time doesn't really exist, but to have a lot of incarnations where you're really not at all in remembrance of your true nature, that's just one experience to me that souls can have. And my experience of what you said, you referred to the category you and I'd fall into as having remembrance. When I started to have remembrance about this time that I incarnated, it specifically to assist in the awakening, it was less to liberate damaged, held souls, and more because it's just time. The species is ready. It's ready to begin the remembrance process at a very large level, and that's exciting. It's exciting. It's a little dicey, but it's exciting because remembrance will open all sorts of new opportunities, including connections with some of our neighbors that wouldn't have made sense before because we simply couldn't understand in that collective sleep, the difference. It would have been like a 5-year-old trying to play with a 50-year-old. I mean, well, that actually works, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just not very satisfying for the 5-year-old for long, or a 15-year-old. It's just too big a gap. But we're at the point where we can begin to collectively remember. We need to collectively remember because these technologies we're creating are going to destroy us if we don't. So that's another reason. It's not just we can. It is important because we're on the verge of some pretty big grown-up toys that could do a lot of damage, and we may really hurt ourselves and others. So there's also a necessity for humanity to come into deeper remembrance.
Yeah, I mean, that one, to me, it really depends on what you emphasize. I do actually resonate with the notion that, and you and I have talked about this, that actually what we call human beings are compositions of many different kinds of life forms with many different kinds of incarnations. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the lore and the literature is that when people are on board the craft, for instance, not just in near-death experiences when they're having a life review and remembering multiple lives, but even being on board the craft, people often remember being a gray alien or sometimes having a parallel existence as a gray alien. So I think there's a lot more than meets the eye going on. I think a lot of the axioms we begin with really limit the landscape. But in the interest of time, let's move on to the last one we're going to discuss, which I think is more in line with what we would think. It's certainly part of it anyway. And this is the notion that the arrangement is more like the tending of a garden. So this is co-creative and nurturing in its nature. So the core idea is that Earth is a co-creative, sacred place, like a garden, that is meant to flourish under stewardship. Key themes are harmony, stewardship, the divine feminine. I have a feeling you're going to like that, Janis. Gaia consciousness. Examples would be indigenous worldviews, permaculture philosophy, and planetary ascension narratives. The alien role here would be as elder siblings, if they are indeed further along in that process, or as nature spirits nurturing planetary consciousness. So how do you think about this one of the garden in terms of a hypothesis?
It resonates a lot to me, partly because one of the perceptions I had when information started to really come in is that I'm part of a group of beings that takes care of planets like this. That was kind of how I felt. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I think that we do that for each other. I can imagine humanity getting to the point where it also becomes, big brothers, big sisters, assistants to other younger species and different planets. I suspect it resonates with the divine feminine instinct too, because that is about caring for your children, caring for the community's children, caring for the community as a whole, caring for the globe as a whole. It's about we help each other along. And that's really just a reflection of the deeper substructure of reality, in the sense that we're all connected. We're all fractals of source. Why wouldn't we? We're not separate from each other. And in a more evolved state, the desire to serve, support, care, tend, cultivate, not cultivate in terms of for resource for your own use, but, to help growth for the sake of growth, to support life for the sake of life, benefits everybody, even whether you're that species or not, for the reason you mentioned earlier, which is we're probably all incarnated as many different species at any time, because there's no such thing as time. So you probably have many expressions going on right now that aren't just earthbound, honestly. So to me, it doesn't cause stress. Again, I'm grateful. It's good to know that we have neighbors that might want to keep us from obliterating ourselves or help us out when we're got ready to step in a massive pothole and break our legs. I mean, I'm good with it. And it does feel more true to the experience that I've had as a human on this planet, both when I'm very human and when I don't feel so that. Do you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot that resonates here. And again, we can have some blending of these as well, because even when you think about the notion of it being a garden and them being mostly hands off, but giving us inspirations here and there to help us move along in this understanding that we are all connected. And there's nothing that teaches that like being on a planet where people go through a stage or stages where they treat the planet like a commodity to be exploited. And then they see how they themselves begin to suffer because of that, because there's this interconnected symbiotic kind of flow. So we are here learning about that. We are learning in real time, like kids that are learning to garden outside the school, how it actually works and how they're impacted by what they garden and what kind of environment they nurture. So this very much fits with me. I very much resonate with the notion that the Gaia Spirit is something we need to come into greater relationship with again. I think we've fallen out of relationship with Gaia, and there's all sorts of negative implications because of that. You pointed to this, that basically this is something I bring up a lot in my classes. I mentioned this both in my talk in Houston and my talk in Denver recently, and that is that my really strong conviction is that pretty much all personal, interpersonal, and collective challenges arise from the illusion of separation and a subset of that, the illusion of scarcity. That those arise as illusions, speaking again of Maya, and only when you have perspective do you end up in the conundrum we're in right now, where we're destroying ourselves by thinking we're not connected. It's kind of like an immune system revolution where your own body is reacting against itself and attacking itself. We've lost sight of the fact that we are connected to everyone and everything. And I like the notion here, it very much fits with my understanding, that the more mature brothers and sisters, taking many different forms, some are biological and physical, some are purely ethereal or non-biological, but this recognition over and over again that we're all holograms of source consciousness, the more you come into an awareness of that, the more powerful you are, because the more you are aligned with the very structure of reality. And the more you want to support the ongoing evolution of your brothers and sisters, because you recognize they are fundamentally no more different than you. So the garden notion definitely fits with a lot of the ways that you think about this, the way that I think about this. And the most important thing is to remember that any splinter of source consciousness has, in some ways, equal potential. And it very much is about remembering, like you said, or as I like to say, resonance. Once you realize that you are not a fixed entity, but you choose by your own engagement how you're going to resonate, and that will harmonically resonate with other beings, other kinds of realities in this vast cosmos, which is multidimensional. Once you realize that, that reframes every single one of these hypotheses and very much supports the notion of human sovereignty, human agency, and for that matter, that's true for every kind of being across the cosmos. Any final comments before we finish off here?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that one. I think it's really important. When it comes to free will, then this becomes very important, because it's the perspective from where you look for the vector of free will. So if I am aware and have connection with what we might call my higher self, right? And I can slide up, that's where I think about it, as like a slide up. I move my view to that broader perspective, then I understand a lot more about why my life looks the way it looks and why it feels like my egoic self is like, I wanted to choose. Like, sorry, it already got chosen. I'm sorry, I've got to have this experience, But It's like the vector of the locus of perspective really makes this whole question of free will look really different. But until you can access that well enough and stay there and are studying it, because that's where the practices come in, right? This is where all the Eastern teachings are just very clear. If you want to understand what's happening here, if you even want to understand what you're doing here, and you want to understand your own unique creative impulse here, you have to learn to access that vantage point where that got designed. Because the egoic self isn't the one who designed it. So I think that's really big. And a lot of people want that, but it does take some effort to do that, to learn how to do that, to hold it and clear out the distortion so you can clear. But it's fun, it's fun. I would highly recommend it to anybody, because otherwise you are just living in these three Mayas, separateness. I'm separate from everybody. I'm doing all this. No, you're not at all. I love that. Now it's such a pathway to surrender for me. I love that I'm not the doer, honestly. The older I get, I'm like, great, somebody else take care of it. I'll just get up and align to it. And since I know it's myself who loves me, I don't worry about aligning to it, even if it's hard. I'm like, I know my best interests are in my heart, my highest self heart. And then the illusion that you're not worthy. But those are the things you can spend lifetime sort of remembering, and then dismantling. And then everything can shift. Everything does shift. And I think that's part of what's happening here at the large level. It's what makes it so exciting to be here right now. There's so many of us remembering and learning to move that up. And everything looks different from that perspective, including what our NHI neighbors or visitors or progenitors doing. What's their motive? Because I don't think we can understand motive until we collectively understand a lot more about that realm. It'll make no sense to us at the purely egoic material realm.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that's part of the lore, again, is that many of the beings will say, if you truly understood who you are, you would understand who we are. And that's saying something I think really important. And to close off here, we're back at this notion of school or mastery training, if you will, depending on how you look at it. And this makes me think about the difference, again, in the non-dual traditions, a subtle difference between Maya and Leela. So Maya is illusion, but in a more subtle, refined kind of perspective, perhaps, it's seen as Leela, which is the playground of spirit, basically. So rather than thinking about it, is it real or it's not, and I need to know, think about it more like everything, every manifest form, every time the formless pours into the form, it's for the sake of the dance, the exploration, and the enjoyment. And that's as much true for us as co-creators as it is for any of these other beings as well. So, bottom line, be aware of energy, because how you align with each of these hypotheses implies an energetic arrangement, a relationship with reality, and that will largely determine your reality more than anything else. All right, we thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll join again in a few weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.